So if your church is working with a lot of parents, and you do different sorts of substance abuse support, you would tend to have an overrepresentation of parents with some of these issues who would tend to have an overrepresentation of kids with some of these issues. And so one of the biggest, probably the most common question that I get in my practice, and that I also get from folks like you, when we're at children's ministry meeting, when you look at kids who struggle with executive functioning, is can they or can't they control it? And it's not a yes or a no question. They can, but it requires a great deal more mental energy or effort for them to self-regulate than it would another kid who doesn't have some of these challenges. And a way of thinking about this, it's like, if you think about your computer and the RAM, you have a certain amount of memory on your computer, and as I'm prone to do when I have 20 different windows and 17 different programs running at once, things start to bog down. And so that, as we talk about designing environments for kids who struggle with self-control, the more stuff they have to process at any point in time in terms of sensory input, in terms of outside stimulation, the more things they have to think about, the more things they have to organize, the more of their capacity they're eating up, and the harder it is for them to devote as much as they need to regulating their behavior and their emotions. How many times do you hear from parents who have a kid where things go relatively well in school and they're able to hold it together, but they get home and all hell breaks loose? Because it takes them 14 hours worth of mental energy to get through a 7-hour school day plus the bus ride. And the parents end up bearing the brunt of that. So, one of the terms that we throw out a lot with kids is this notion of structure. And one of the reasons why structure is so beneficial to kids who are wired this way is that you're reducing the number of things they have to process or think about so that they can devote as much of their mental capacity as possible to focusing on the things that you think are most important. There's a great study looking at this, and it applied to all kids, not just kids with ADHD, where we'd done a blog post on this actually. About a year and a half ago, there was a study that was done with a group of first graders. And they had a teacher teach a science lesson in a classroom where they had the usual pictures and decorations up on the wall in the classroom, versus doing it in a room that looked more like this, where there wasn't a lot of stuff hanging on the walls. And not only did the kids learn a lot more, but they had significantly fewer behavior problems when they were in an environment where they were decreasing the amount of visual stimulation that was present while the kids were learning. And so, we'll get into this in a few minutes and talk about some specific, solutions, but in particular for this group, the way that we design our environments is going to be most impactful on the kids who struggle to regulate their behavior and their emotions. Now, sensory processing, you'll hear people talk about this notion of sensory processing disorder. It was not a formal diagnosis included in the DSM-5 a couple of years ago. But a better way of looking at it is that it is a trait that cuts across different diagnostic categories and would be very common among the kids and to some extent some of the parents that you're going to be encountering in your ministry. And so that it's important to think about with these folks, I see a lot of these, different children's ministry websites. There's this Worlds of Wow that create these spectacular indoor playgrounds that they have at some places. You see the design with the vibrant colors in a lot of places. For some of the kids that we're talking about, the sort of loud music, the bright lights, just the buzz of people coming inside and in and out of church, when before and after service on Sunday morning. It's aversive, and they find the touch, and they may find the smell of different cologne or perfume. The lighting, it's noxious to them, and they have a hard time being able to tolerate this. And it's the transition times before you're starting ministry or when you're letting out ministry or when kids are going from one environment to another that it tends to be the biggest challenge. A kid in our practice, this is sort of an interesting story in terms of a way that he was accommodated, but he very much had an issue with this, and his dad was a pastor on staff at the church. And so that, for him, being a part of the children's ministry is really important. But what the team came up with was, I thought pretty brilliant, that he could do everything that the other kids could do, but the 20 to 25 minutes when they had sort of the loud music and they were doing the praise and worship and everybody was dancing around, that for him was overwhelming. They made him part of the parking crew. So they gave him an orange vest, sent him out with the team, and had him greeting people on Sunday morning as they pulled in with their cars and was, helping to assist some of the adults in directing folks to parking spaces. People loved him. He was serving, and by the time they would finish up, it was right around the time that the last song Kids Praise finished up. Jake would come in, and from then on Sunday morning did everything that everybody else was doing. We did a thing, we'd done a fair amount of training not too far up the road at like Cincinnati Vineyard. And one of the things that they did specifically to help folks with this issue is that they created a sensory-friendly entrance to their children's ministry area. Sort of almost like a VIP entrance where the lighting was more muted, things were quiet, there was not a lot of foot traffic in that area, and they could do their check-in with the kids, in an environment that was calming as they were entering, entering like the bricks and mortar church, as opposed to the bustle of, their children's area where they may have 2,000 kids passing through on a Sunday morning between all of their different services. Next up is this issue about the reluctance to self-disclose. And in our practice, we end up seeing a lot of kids, for example, in public school, who are in some sort of special education service. And I would say conservatively, especially among our middle school kids, probably half the kids who are eligible for accommodations and support don't use them because, I don't want to be on the short bus. They don't want other kids in the school to see them going into a room that signifies that they're different or in some ways inadequate. And so, as we were getting into this discussion about special needs ministry, one of the things that we've encountered is that the kinds of kids and families that I'm talking about will tend to flee anything that's identified as being special needs, because what they want more so than anything else is to be just like everybody else. And so one of the reasons why they're reluctant to self-disclose is because, the child, or the parent would be horrified by the notion that their kid had like an identified buddy that singles them out for special attention within the larger group. One of the other reasons why they are uncomfortable disclosing is this one. And as a psychiatrist in my 30th year, it's probably only been in the last year or two that I fully understood the reasons why stigma about mental health concerns is such a significant issue in the church. And ironically, it is oftentimes an issue in the most evangelically minded churches who would otherwise, see this as an underserved population and, grasp this as an opportunity to pursue. So take a couple of minutes and sort of give you the background on this. We did a whole blog series on this topic last winter, and it's really fascinating because I think a lot of Christians don't understand why in certain circles of the church we tend to view mental health concerns the way that we do. Well, back in the 60s, in response to the sexual revolution, and in particular there was a psychologist named Albert Ellis who developed something called rational emotive therapy. And you see a lot of this thinking in the postmodernism that has so influenced society in the 21st century, where they would argue that there's no absolute right or wrong. Everyone can decide for himself or herself, what is right or wrong. That when people feel guilty, it is, repression due to, sort of the cultural perceptions about there being an absolute right and wrong. Well, given the influence that had, particularly in the field of psychology, less so in psychiatry, there was a Presbyterian pastor named J. Adams who, in response to this, developed an entire model of doing quote-unquote biblical counseling that became very influential in the church beginning in the early 70s and very much continuing to this day. One of our board members was asking me, that there is American Association of Christian Counselors. There are like 7,000 of these guys meeting in Nashville, and they're going, well, why aren't we presenting at that? Well, the reality, there's Jonathan Holmes. We have Parkside Church, if any of you are familiar with Alistair Begg from the radios in our community. Again, very conservative, traditional place in terms of their teaching. And so Jonathan's a biblical counselor, and he kind of took me under his wing and was sort of explaining the way this world worked. Because in large numbers of the church, and a lot of these folks, again, who label themselves biblical or nouthetic counselors, they believe that mental illness is caused by, that what we call mental illness is actually sin. And we have these things because either we committed some sin, have some pattern of sin, or because there is some lack of adequacy of our faith. That's why folks get depressed. That's why people struggle with anxiety. And this paradigm is still very prevalent, in many areas of the church today. John MacArthur is a pastor out in California who's very influential, who very much is a proponent of this view. And as a result, a lot of the folks from this mindset, it is very common for them never to refer to a psychologist or to a psychiatrist. And again, when you start looking at, what oftentimes these folks are doing in their counseling is that they're trying to help people, to identify the pattern of sin. Or if it's a situation where a family is dealing with the child, the view might be that it's because the parents haven't adequately disciplined the child or aren't taking the time to care for that child, or are inconvenienced by the parenting demands of that child, that they're having the issues that they're having. And given this attitude and the way it's spilled over into the church, you can understand why a lot of people would be very, very reluctant to self-identify. There were a couple of boys I had in our practice whose family became active at our church in the late 1990s. And we had Disability Sunday, and the mom got up in front of the church and was talking about their experience, on the west side of Cleveland, looking for a church to attend with two young boys with pretty significant ADHD. And the comment that she made is that people in the church believe that they can tell when a disability ends and bad parenting begins. And, she came away from that experience feeling very, very judged, and they had a very hard time finding a place to fit in. This is where it comes from. Now, I don't mean to suggest that there aren't situations where this mindset about things isn't applicable. And I can think about some situations, and specifically that we see with kids. And one of the things in particular that a lot of the kids, teenagers that I would see in our practice would struggle with is a lot of times kids who struggle regulating their emotions, when they become sexually active, have a very difficult time managing the intensity of the emotion that lets loose. And it's not unusual for us to get into kids becoming very depressed and very suicidal as a result of their inability to deal with sort of like the days and like the day-to-day like little stupid ups and downs of like dating relationships, where we can go back and we can say that they did something that violated what the Bible teaches, and then the series of consequences that ensued from that contributed to a mental health condition in front of us. That happens some of the time, but it doesn't happen all of the time. And one of the things I've had the privilege to do because of the nature of our ministry is that I have come across some folks around the country who are involved in ministry, and some of the, the godliest, just people who have a heart for the Lord, who just do fabulous things in serving, who continue to struggle with mental illness despite the fact that they're doing everything that they can do, to live the kinds of lives that we're called to lead. And so that there may be times that God has other purposes in this stuff for us as individuals or for our kids. And that, one fabulous book that I saw, I think is a great resource, that was written by Rhett Smith, is that he talked about The Anxious Christian is the title of the book. And his argument is that a lot of times it may be that God is using these conditions, to draw us into a closer relationship and into a closer dependency upon Him. And the famous verse in Philippians, be not anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition. It's not saying that we're anxious because we don't pray enough. We're saying that we should use our anxiety as a signal to turn to God in prayer when you look at, those verses. But as a result of the stigma in the church around this whole piece with mental health, you understand how, especially in evangelical circles, the special needs ministry evolved. You wouldn't think about mental health being part of a disability ministry, because if mental health is a sin problem as opposed to a disability, why on earth would people in a disability ministry think about serving these kids, or serving their parents? And then the last barrier, again, is this apple doesn't fall too far from the tree issue. And that one of the things that we came to appreciate is that, if your kid's under 16, you need mom or dad, by and large, to drive them to church. And so that, thinking about, what are some of the things that we need to do from an inclusion standpoint to make it easier for parents to come, is going to come into play and make it a lot easier for us to implement an inclusion ministry for kids who are struggling with similar issues. One thing, we're doing a training, this is about 5 years ago at Northland Church down in Orlando. And their children's ministry director, a lady named Debbie Blahnik, had a theory that the kids with mental health concerns, that a disproportionate number of their families were found in the irregular attender group. In that, it's the mom who oversleeps, who has a hard time being able to get ready for church. Or folks who may need some encouragement or some external accountability. So that one of the things that I've seen places do, and that they do in our home church that is potentially beneficial, is that they really try to encourage as much as possible getting folks, when they start coming, where this is suspected, into relationships with other people. So that in the case of the church in Northland, find another family that comes every week and have them send a text message an hour before church, just to remind, I'd like to see you there, we'll be sitting, blah, blah, blah. There are ways that we're looking at exploring, like using technology to be able to help support some of these kinds of functions. And so, one of the places that I would start thinking about, these families maybe being at risk, is to go back and take a look at the children, the youth you're serving now. If there are people who don't come all the time, where there's not some obvious reason like a divorce, or folks who had been coming for a while and then stopped coming, somebody giving them a phone call, sending them an email, sending them a text, well, what's going on? Anything we need to be praying for? Is there anything that made it hard for you to come? Might be a way of thinking about reaching out to this specific group. Now, here are the 7 strategies. So we talked about the 8 barriers. We talked about social isolation, social communication, fear, capacity for self-control, sensory processing, the reluctance to self-disclose, stigma, and parents who have disabilities as being the 8 barriers. I put together a little mnemonic to remember sort of the 7 strategies to help, which is teacher. So T stands for how you build your inclusion team, because you need a team to do this, that nobody is going to have the time or energy or skill set to take this on themselves. E has to do with environments and how you as a church look at developing more welcoming ministry environments for the kids and families we're looking to serve. A has to do with including them in activities with high impact. How do you get these kids and their parents into those activities that your pastor or the leadership of your church thinks are most critical in helping people to be able to grow in their faith? C stands for communication and developing a church-wide communication strategy for how we talk about mental health and trauma. H has to do with helping other people. And are there ways that we can start developing relationships with these families outside of the church by being able to meet their most heartfelt and immediate needs? E is how can we as a church provide education and support to families within our church and in the larger community? And R has to do with responsibility, in that this is not something that is a church staff function exclusively. In fact, I suggest it works best when the vast preponderance of responsibility for this type of ministry falls in the hands of what I would call like the amateur, non-professional Christians, those of us who are involved with the church every week, but don't get a paycheck for what we do. So, taking a look at these strategies a little bit further then, who needs to be at the table? And I would say that if you're looking at doing something as a church, the most important factor is to make sure that the senior leadership has signed off. You know, your senior pastor, those of you who are run by like elder boards, that that the church board would have signed off on this. And that it works best if the senior leader and the folks who head different ministry departments are all involved with like the inclusion team. But even if you're in a place where maybe you don't have the support for that, you can think about, within the constraints of like what you're allowed to do based on your job description or your volunteer description. Think about like how you could incorporate this within your own ministry area if it's not something your church is prepared to do as a whole. And so some people to think about that you would want to have on your team. Some of these, it's like, duh, like, if you had, somebody like me, a psychologist, counselors, folks like that in your church, obviously they would be helpful. Occupational therapists for helping folks with sensory issues are oftentimes helpful because, at least in Ohio, the way licenses work in our state, they're probably the ones who provide the most direct service to that population. An interior designer, in terms of thinking about how does your ministry space look, and in particular, what are you doing if you're like remodeling or renovating certain ministry spaces, and are there some things that you can do in that process to make it more friendly to more kids and more families? Media specialists that Sarah was talking today about, like the benefits of Facebook and how people found out about this conference. And it's nice to meet like Lisa and some of her friends from the disability ministry in Chattanooga here in person, who I've never met at a conference before. And so that part of this type of ministry to the community is that there are a lot of people who, particularly with the advent of social media, can use their social networks and their connections to get the word out to people in your community, who might have an interest in being a part of church but haven't been able to come before. So that's talking a little bit about the team. Now, when it comes to ministry environments, part of what our goal is that we want something that's pleasant and inviting, but we also want an environment where where it serves the function for which it was created. If it's a teaching environment or a worship environment, we want the environment to be such that they remember the most important things that your pastor had to say in his message tomorrow morning. We want, one of the things that folks don't think about necessarily with this is that a lot of people who have mental health concerns, and this would even be true for like older people where they're starting to get into some neurocognitive things, have a great deal of difficulty processing directions. So like one part of your environment that a lot of people overlook is very clear signage to help folks figure out, if they're unfamiliar with your building or your campus, where it is that they need to go. Because, for example, if you have a kid with ADHD and you want to do a little experiment and get home, ask them to take the clothes basket that is in the laundry room, carry it upstairs, put their clothes in the dirty basket, bring it downstairs and set it next to the washer. And I want you to tell me what the odds are that they would be able to remember to do that. And it's probably about the odds that the Browns are going to win their last 7 games, get into the playoffs, and make their first ever appearance in the Super Bowl. I'm not holding my breath. But if you think about this, I mean, if you think about this in the context of folks, in an unfamiliar church, the anxious person's worried that they're going to get lost and have to ask somebody for help. The person who is overwhelmed by everything going on is going to have a hard time remembering, the directions that somebody might give them to weave in and out of hallways throughout your building. We talked about this a little bit in terms of the executive functioning standpoint, in that the less stuff that's going on, the easier it is for kids to maintain control. When we had been doing this training at Cincinnati Vineyard, where they set up sort of their separate sensory entrance, we were walking through and we were training their children's area, and it was about this size, but it looked like a box of Crayola crayons had exploded across the walls. So when they were talking about some of the challenges they were having with kids with behavior, our suggestion to them was repaint all of the walls, but do it in the jewel tone equivalent of the primary color that you have up on the wall. They did that. They dimmed their lights, and they had 50% fewer incidents with their kids in the children's ministry in the subsequent quarter, after they went ahead and implemented those things. This is a picture up in the front of, our daughter's in college in Chicago, and so we visited Willow Creek one Sunday, just to go and sort of see what that was like. But if you take a look the way that they set up their auditorium, they have a couple windows on the side, but you notice that there's an area in the front that's black. They have some lighting directly in front of the stage. Everything, the way their environment is set up, is drawn to focus your attention on what's going on, in either the pulpit or the worship stage at the moment. And so, I've got, and if you come into the ADHD anxiety presentation later, I've actually got some pictures of different churches with worship spaces set up and different children's ministry examples of things that people did well and things that folks didn't do so well, in terms of being able to create those kinds of welcoming environments. We talked about this issue of including people then in the high impact activities. So if you start with the mindset, what is it that we want people to experience that will help them most, in growing to be more like Jesus? This drives the specifics of whatever intervention you're going to do at your church. So if you think about, for example, if small groups are really important, do you find ways of being able to provide childcare to folks who need it if you want those parents to be able to attend and to be part of a small group? Are there ways that you think about setting up different service activities so that there would be some options for the family who has maybe a child with anxiety who would be uncomfortable passing out Christmas shoe boxes? Could they be in the back room packing the shoe boxes as opposed to being the one who actually has to pass out the shoe boxes to the kids who are coming to receive them? Are there ways to think about how we would include some of our older kids and how we might prepare them for the opportunity to say go on a mission trip? Are there some other things that we need to do? If in fact weekend worship is a big thing at your church, and in the context of thinking about special needs, and in this context too, I realize that we've become very family-oriented in our philosophy of ministry. And so that, I was doing a training, and there was a woman who was working with a kid on a pretty deep end of the autism spectrum, who was a volunteer who got intensely frustrated about this kid not being able to focus enough to learn their lesson for the day. And in my mind, it was kind of okay, this is great, but it's the cherry on top of the sundae from Graders. In that, because she was there, this kid's mom and dad were up listening to their preacher having getting exposed to the teaching at church. His 2 older siblings were involved in their age-appropriate ministry areas who weren't involved in those ministry areas before you guys launched your disability ministry. And the reality for a lot of the kids that we're talking about serving today is that because of their attention, or because of their fear, or because of the idiosyncrasies they have in social communication, their parents are going to know better how to communicate things to them than even their special education teacher, if they have one, much less your ministry volunteers. So we would consider it a win anytime any family member of a kid with disability has the opportunity to have a meaningful connection or experience of your local church. So that, just figuring out how to get these kids into the building so that their parents can be a part of stuff has a lot of spillover effects, because, it's not the job of those of us who are on staff at church to raise our kids and teach them about the faith. It's the parents' job to do that. It's the job of the church to come alongside them and support them and to resource them for the process. So that it's really critical to think about how we get our parents involved in everything that you want to help them grow, because they will then be able to share that with their kids in the most individualized way that is most likely to be impactful. So I should probably get off my high horse at this point and move on.